It's 75 years. How important is it that people in Britain keep moments like this?
Oliver Phillips. I wrote quite a bit about Sandringham Road, and I mean no offence, but there was a time when I actually liked doodle bugs. Perception is not a strong quality when you're 3 years old, as I was in 1944. To me, the doodle bugs were naughty, but a source of entertainment. Their very nickname suggested they were a bit of a pest. But they actually did just as my mother told them. She told them to move on, keep going, and they did. And I was impressed. When the alert sounded, my mother used to pick me up out of the bed and take me down the stairs and lay me on cushions by the solid party wall, and then cover me with her body, and then she pulled the sofa over us. It was a lovely time. My senses awash with talcum powder and scent. The anxiety, the excitement, the free biscuits, the extra bit of orange juice. These remarks are incongruous in the light of the events we remember today, but I knew no better because there was this perceived excitement of war. One night my mother told a doodlebug to move on, and it did, but it seemed somehow reluctant. If you go on YouTube, you can hear that sound that I remembered very well. It brought shivers down my spine after all those years hearing a doodlebug going through the air, that low sound. But this one, it seemed like a motorbike with a semi-blocked petrol filter. And it went on, my mother told it to go on, and it went on, and it faded into the distance. And then there was this vast thud. Last night I looked it up. With the help of Google nowadays you can find out. Where I lived, to the epicentre in Sandringham Road, was 1.26 miles. It was such a thud that the glasses tinkled in our sideboard 1.26 miles away. Somebody's bought it, somebody's got it, my mother said to me, in a tone that really brought home the fact that doodlebugs were not that likeable. It was a hell of a thud. I remember thinking to myself, that could have broken the glasses in the sideboard. Yet a year later, in 1945, as a 4-year-old, I heard a biplane going over us one sunny October morning, and I shouted, "Doodlebug," and my mother shook her head. No more doodlebugs. But you know, I felt a sense of loss, because I associated that. Because I remember quite clearly the camaraderie, the excitement during the war, when you could almost touch that. Strangers were always talking to each other. At a bus stop, you walked to a bus stop and people immediately talked to you. Queues in buses, trains and shops, and were there queues in those days. But that camaraderie slowly disappeared after VE Day. We got back to our own insular lives. I grew up in Watford, heard the legend of Sandringham Road, Parkgate Road. There was a house of ill repute. with Yanks queuing up outside the front door. There was an engagement party. This was caused in the vacuum, as I explained, by the memorial, because you weren't allowed to say anything about what had happened, what bomb had dropped where. And we don't know, because although they reckon most of the, all the spies were turned, in other words, they were sending false information back to Germany because they had become double agents, I don't know if the chap, when they discovered in the 80s the Eagle's Eyrie and the Bull pub in Bovingdon, up in the attic, a transmitter, books, recording gear and everything, you know, did they know about him? Seems not. So someone made up stories in the vacuum of no information. They pulled 100 bodies from one house, it was popularly told. I was told that in 1999. If they had 100 bodies in one of those houses, suffocation would have been a problem long before the V1 got near it. People made up things to feel important, I suppose. It is sad that such people exist. In the wake of this type of tragedy, there are rumour mongers, and regrettably, as in the case of Sandringham Road, looters. The stories about Sandringham Road, they were all garbage. The garbage was left to fester for 55 years. One day, at the age of 57, I was asked by the town hall to question any memories of Sandringham Road and put them on the nostalgia page, which we had then. That was a broadsheet page, and the council, in concert with the co-op funeral service, had refurbished the memorial that we see today. It was 1999, 55 years after the tragedy. I was up to my eyes in Millennium supplements, and Watford were gaining promotion to the Premiership. I didn't have time for anything. And frankly, I wasn't supposed to investigate questions. The questions were supplied by you, the readers, and I used to put the question in every week and then drop it down, put a new question on top of it, but I repeated that question every week until I got an answer from you. They'd either phone me up or write in, and I used to edit the letters or put down the interviews as statements from them and put them in the paper. But I'd heard the folklore about Sandringham Road, we all had, and I admit I was a bit half-hearted about the whole thing. But I placed the question at the top of the page, and then one afternoon, Violet phoned me. She was at number 68, and she was in bed with her sister, with a small baby by the side in a cot, fully clothed in a cot by the side of her. For some reason she was unable to explain. She got up and went in the bedroom next door and got her son out and put him in the bed beside her and her sister. And then later, the next thing she knew, there was this vast explosion. And she could see the houses opposite tumble one by one, mostly in the faces, but they tumbled. The reason she was able to witness the slow motion domino effect was that the front of her house had been the first to go. Rescuers eventually recovered her baby. It was not difficult, but you can't explain such things. She was found naked on top of the debris, unhurt, unscratched. All of them survived, but Violet was actually pinned to the bed. And while they were trying to rescue her, the floor collapsed and she went down to the ground floor with still more on top of her. 6 hours after the explosion, they pulled her free. Violet's awful tale had a relatively happy ending, but it piqued me. I took her number and we talked regularly over the ensuing months. As with all survivors of that tragedy, I would contact them and read back their statements. You're not supposed to do that as a journalist, but I wanted to get a total endorsement of recording what were very personal and traumatic experiences. So I came up to the memorial here and I noted that 40 had died, and that was a guesstimate on part of the council. It also said that the remains of 12 were buried beneath. But yet, try as I might, I could only count 11 names on the memorial. That intrigued me. There was no, journalists are like that, something like that about you, it stays with you. And it also intrigued me that there were no inquests. No, nothing was known. Nothing. No one seemed to know anything. I've got in contact with the War Museum, nothing. But if you find anything out, can you let us know? The county coroners, nothing. And other august bodies, and funny enough, I suppose it was logical really. The only people who could help me was Watford Register Office. And they said to me, you apply to us, and if you died as a result of that tragedy, we will provide the death certificates and you'll pay for the death certificates. But if you provide us names that didn't die in Sandringham Road, you won't have to pay for them. I suppose they knew me by reputation that I'd be coming back, because they very quickly got the 36 names out of their archives and had them all ready for death certificates. They couldn't hand me that list. Can you imagine that? That's bureaucracy for you. They couldn't give me the list of the names I was searching for, because there's such a thing as the Data Protection Act that had come in. So I had to scroll through 156,000 names, and that's the number of people who died in Britain in the quarter, July, August, September in 1944. And I had to isolate those who died in Watford. It sounds daunting, I can tell you it was. It was all on microfiche, and if anybody's ever seen white on black going through a small screen, it is printed at the County Record Office and at various other august bodies in the smallest typeface known to man. It was just about readable. But finally I submitted 170 names to Watford Registry Office, and I paid for the death certificates of those who actually died in the V1 disaster. I couldn't do much time at work, I was up to my eyes in it, so I used Sunday mornings, Saturday mornings, and whatever spare time I had to track down the saga of Sandringham Road. It led me to calls to Memphis, Tennessee and to Kentucky. It took 5 months of intensive work, because I came involved, lived and breathed Sandringham Road, and spurred on by Violet and another dear person, Maureen. She had never talked of the incident since it happened. And one day her cousin phoned me, a Mrs. Slaughter, and said Maureen was determined to phone me and had been talking about phoning me for a week. To talk about something she had never talked about in her life before. Would I be kind, considerate, not push her? She was a little fragile, I was assured. One morning, a well-spoken but tremulous voice came on the phone. She told me her name was Maureen, and without any prompting from me, she unburdened herself 55 years of guilt. She had a premonition. She was at a dance hall in Watford, and she told her soon-to-become, or then fiancé, that she had to get home. And he said, it's not finished yet. No, we've got to get home now. I've got to go. We've got to go. And she came all the way along there, Water Lane, and all the way up, and eventually she got back to the house, said goodbye to her boyfriend, ran in, and threw her arms round her parents. She had a premonition, that's all. And then, when it was time for bed, she went and hugged them and said goodbye. Goodbye. And I said, well, oh, sorry, good night. Good night. And she went upstairs. The next thing she knew, she was a little cut and bruised. She looked out at she managed to open her bedroom door. There was no stairwell, there was no real front, just rubble. She climbed out of what had been the window, remembering that there was a lean-to. What she didn't know is that had gone well, but there was a little 2-foot square piece of concrete, and she landed on that, and she was held down. Had it not been for the concrete, she might have been seriously injured. The ARP said, come on, you've got to go down to Parkgate Road, we're doing all the dressing and things, you've got cuts, you've got bruises. And she said, no, I've got to get in and help in the rubble and try and find my parents. She thought she heard her father say, you get out, Maureen, they'll rescue us next. But she was worried because there was fire. But they insisted she went down up to Parkgate Road and that they were being rescued next. Her boyfriend lived some 2 or 3 streets away, and like everybody else heard the thud, and he rushed down and he just found the whole mountain of rubble when he climbed up in it, looking, you know, because he didn't know exactly where, but the back of the house seemed okay, but Maureen wasn't there. And eventually he came across a leg and he pulled the rubble off, and it was Maureen's brother, who was pulled coughing and spitting dust and bricks and everything like that. He lived and became a vicar. But there was nothing he or anyone could do in the fire to save the parents. Her mother and father both died in the fire that night, and she never spoke of the thing for 55 years. I phoned her many times after that, principally to check she was okay. I felt responsible, but also honoured that she'd chosen me to unload that guilt. Her cousin phoned and thanked me. This gentle, fragile woman had suddenly blossomed. She had discovered, almost certainly, she couldn't have done anything. And her failure and guilt had been assuaged to some degree. It transpired my questions were not intrusive but curative for so many, because they too had lived in a vacuum, having lost dear ones, and no one knew because of the ban on publicity. They've been part of the great tragedy, the biggest tragedy in Hertfordshire. But their experiences were left unheard. Looking back on the war in 1945, the local newspapers summed up all the bombs that dropped in the area. And Sandringham Road was noticed as the biggest casualty list. With that, the world gratefully moved on. We had rationing, the Cold War, and all those awful winters and power cuts. But the survivors have lost more than their loved ones. They had lost the community of their youth. Everyone in Sandringham Road really knew each other. In those days, of course, it was before fridges were prevalent, and people had to go out and shop every day, and they went up to St Albans Road and they bumped in Mrs Dinkle from London 99, etc, etc, and they talked and they nodded to each other, and they went to school in Parkgate Road, and then one day nothing, they were all dispersed everywhere to relatives all over the place. Some went to Wales, one went to Swindon, I know of, some went to London, and they never saw each other again. So where they shopped, it was said that 100 windows were blown out in St Albans Road alone. Anything that survived, the looters took. And of course, counselling in those days was a stiff scotch, an instruction to brace your shoulders back and face the world with a stiff upper lip. So for 55 years, their suffering went unreported and buried in wartime statistics. It was Maureen who really inspired me to become involved and plunged me into a whole other life in my spare time. I got involved because of Violet, Maureen, and later Jimmy Salt, who lost a brother, both parents and 2 sisters in the tragedy. A brother, I asked? I've no such record of a brother. And then it all unfolded. His brother, Harry, slept on the settee by the front window. So when the bomb went off so many yards away, his body was vaporised. They found bits of Harry's Salt. Frankly, there were a lot of bits found that morning, but DNA was years away. No body, no death certificate, and so for Harry, no grave. There was no doubt that Harry Salt had died that fateful night, so I discovered the missing name from that memorial. The council, understandably, had been reluctant to put that name there. They mentioned 12 and they put 11 names. But they were worried in case sometime in 1946 Harry turned up whistling happily as ever. One day in 1999, after presenting all the evidence to the council, they carved his name on the memorial. Now there are 12 names to go on the remains of the 12, which include the names of his parents and 2 sisters. One of the highlights of my journalistic career to see Jimmy visit that memorial one Sunday morning and burst into tears at the sight of Harry's name before he threw his arms around my neck. The 36 death certificates plus Harry's Salt brought the total to 37, proven, witnessed, annotated. There were many stories, anecdotes and ironies. I spent many weeks. I remember one night going home on a Sunday evening with the South West Arts telephone directory and phoning every Griffiths mentioned, Griffith or Griffiths, because I'd been told they knew the whereabouts of what had become of a young girl who survived the explosion and was found under a settee by a party wall. That resonated with me. There was a woman who sat up every night in a chair by the window. She was a little Scottish lady. And looking out, she looked out on Sandringham Road, and when she was asked, she said, "I want to see the V1 that kills me." She had that belief. She was convinced, and she was right. And her headless body was found in the road about 4 yards outside her house, still in the armchair. There were 2 sisters who rowed over the nightly trek down to the bomb shelter. One was gregarious and quite liked the general camaraderie evenings, and the other one didn't. She was shy and she found it a bit lacking in privacy and everything, and persuaded her mother to stay. And so the sister eventually came home from the shelter to find she'd lost her sister and mother. There was a fortnightly visitor to Sandringham Road who stayed with a friend alternate weekends. She was due to entertain her friend in Surrey that weekend, but the lady, Miss Glenister, was not feeling well. So Mrs. Seabrook came to Sandringham Road instead and perished. The irony is that they're both buried in the churchyard in the village where they should have been staying that night. The ironies continued. The Salts, the Rices and the Gibbons moved to Watford from London. Why? To escape the bombs. The Rices and Salts were given no time in which to reflect on the irony of that, and it was left to the Gibbons to mourn the loss of their friends. Death was instant. The Salts, incidentally, were market traders, and they dealt in cash. Along with the odd bits of bodies, rescuers noted the bomb site was awash with £1 and 10-bob notes which sprinkled by the explosion like confetti. In 1999, my mother was dying and suffering from Alzheimer's. I asked my mother one afternoon in 1999 if she remembered when the V1 went over and there was a thud and the glasses tinkled, and she said someone had bought it. She smiled. She said, "Yes, I do." She reached for my hand and squeezed it. It was the last time I saw her smile. And then I explained I just spent 5 months finding out exactly who had bought it in that far-off night. Journalism is often held in ill repute, and deservedly so in some cases. But 45 years full-time and 14 more part-time as a journalist, I can look back and say Sandringham Road saw me at my best. put it this way, I spent 45 years covering Watford FC for the local newspapers, but I did not come over for the FA Cup final from my home in France. But I did remember all those who died and those marvellous people who survived and talked to me, helped me, and in a sense we helped each other, as their awful experiences, loss and trauma were placed on record. So when I heard about this memorial, I came over, purely and simply for them. Thank you.